monthly heritage talk. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. For those of you who may not be familiar with Tamil Heritage Trust, let me give you a very quick and brief introduction. We were set up as a non-profit way back in 2010 with the objective of understanding, appreciating, disseminating, celebrating India's rich and varied heritage. Towards these, we conduct a number of programs, the flagship program being the monthly heritage talk, which has been going on almost uninterrupted for the last 12 odd years. We have the online version on the first Saturday of every month at 5:30 p.m. like now, and we have resumed the in-person version on third Saturdays here in Chennai, where we are based. We also conduct seminars, in-depth seminars once a year to coincide with the music season, the Kacheri season of Chennai. So we call it the Pechi Kacheri, which is essentially a concert of talks focusing on one or two specific topics during the course of the year. Over the last couple of years, since we went online, we've also conducted Indology festivals once a year, an annual event. This year in June, the topic was the temple builders of medieval India in the 8th to 13th centuries, where we talked of a number of dynasties and royal households that have left behind legacy of great temples for us today, but who featured between the 8th and 13th centuries. We had 14 talks with experts from all over the country at the festival. All our talks and videos are available online for viewing. It's free on YouTube, and I would request interested members of the audience to please subscribe to the channel as well as click on the bell icon to receive your notifications of all our future programs. We also conduct workshops here in Chennai, how to see a temple, how to see a museum, and on scripts like Pallava Grantha and so on. Our next workshop, the Mallai study tour on Mamallapuram, will be announced shortly. We expect to be doing one during the course of this month. We also conduct site seminars where every participant is both a student and a teacher, having prepared on specific sites in depth before we visit them, and then to guide each other through the process of visiting those sites and monuments. We have a fledgling program for teachers. For heritage, it's called Alamaravai in Tamil, where we support teachers who are interested and show initiative in wanting to take the message of India's rich heritage to their students and to their communities across Tamil Nadu. We've been requested by the family of the great epigraphist, Shri V. Venkaya, to anchor the Epigraphy Award instituted in his name. And I'm glad to inform you that the first edition of that award was won by Dr. Y. Subrailu, who's done such sterling work in epigraphy and Indian history, especially South Indian history. We also have another award to recognize exceptional individual contributions to the understanding and the preservation of India's heritage. This is named after our co-founder, whom you see there handing away the award. This is called the THT Professor S. Swaminathan Heritage Award. And just earlier this week, on Tuesday, the award for 2022 was given away to Shri Pradeep Chakravarti for his wide range of work in areas of heritage and history. If you'd like to join our mailing list, please send us a mail to admin@tamilheritage.in. That's admin@tamilheritage.in. Which brings us to today's speaker. It's indeed a privilege and a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Yashaswini Chandra, and thank you so very much, Dr. Chandra, for accepting our invitation to address the Tamil Heritage Trust audience. She will be talking on the Sea Horse, a South Indian history on horseback, based on her widely popular book, A Tale of the Horse. Dr. Chandra took a PhD from the SOAS University of London. Her research bridges history and art history. She has taught courses on Indian history and Himalayan art and culture at the SOAS, as well as JNU and Ashoka University. She's an affiliated fellow of the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, CSDS, in New Delhi. Earlier, she had worked for Sahapedia and managed very large projects first the multi-volume documentation of the Rashtrapati Bhavan, and as well as projects involving institutional collaborations with the ASI and the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies and the Rubaiyat Sansthan in Jodhpur. As you would expect from someone who's written a book on horses, she is herself an avid horsewoman. Her earlier book is one that she co-edited. It's called The Right of the Line, the President's Bodyguard, and it's about the household cavalry of the Indian president. And of course, she's now famous across the world of Indian history for The Tale of the Horse, the history of India on horseback, from which she will be sharing excerpts today. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Yashaswini Chandra, and over to you, Dr. Chandra.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Raman, for that very generous introduction, and to you and Mr. Shishadri and the Tamil Heritage Trust for inviting me to talk about one aspect of my book. It's such a pleasure to be able to focus on one aspect rather than trying to give an overview of the book. So I'll begin with, if I can share my screen and begin and show my presentation. Okay, so this is the cover of my book. And on the image on front is just to give you an idea of my book, because I'm going to be focusing on one aspect of it. The image, the front image, is a famous painting by the Pahari painter Nain Sukh. And the reason I chose it for the front cover is because it's representative. Because this book is not just concerned with elite male associations with the horse, but also brings in horsewomen and nomadic pastoral classes that were involved with the breeding and trading of horses, and the subaltern classes that looked after horses. Which is why on the back cover, there's a painting by a famous Rajasthani artist, Bhakta, which features a horse along with its groom or sais. The book is divided into 3 parts. Well, actually 4 parts. There's a prologue, which sort of introduces the book and quickly goes through the ancient history pertaining to the horse. The second part is an overview of the horse scene. It consists of 4 chapters. One is concerned with North India, the second with South India, and that is the chapter that I'm going to be focusing on in my talk today. Then there's a chapter concerned with the different horse breeding territories of India, and finally one that focuses on the Mughals, because I argue that a number of aspects of the horse culture of India came together in the Mughal period, and horsemanship in India reached an apogee of sorts under the Mughals. And the next 2 parts are dedicated to Rajasthan. In the next 2 parts, I make a case study of Rajasthan because it's my area, one of my main areas of research. So there are 2 myths about the origin of the horse on the Indian horse scene. The first is concerned with the advent of Uchchai-Shravas, the primordial horse that emerged from this cosmic ocean after it was churned by the Devas and the Asuras in an event which is widely known as the Samudra Manthan. And the second one relates the descent of horses from heaven. They were considered winged celestial beings, and they were believed to have been banished to earth by Lord Indra. But the one that is the myth which is particularly relevant to this talk is the one concerned with the Uchchai-Shravas, because it's highly evocative. It almost anticipates the sea trade in horses that continued, that was well established by the 10th century. That went on from the 10th century until the turn of the 20th century, until actually the 1950s, and may have begun a lot earlier. Evidence is plentiful from the 10th century onwards. And this trade was largely directed towards South India. So just to give you an overview, through much of India's history, horses were imported from Central Asia through Afghanistan into North India, and also from Tibet, incidentally, by caravan routes, and from the Middle East, through the Red Sea, from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf to the ports of South India. They were also the sea trade was also directed towards Sindh and Gujarat, but vast numbers of horses were received in South India. And horses over time also began to be bred in different parts of India. Much of, in the foothills of the Himalayas, then in Western India, different parts of Western India, and also the Bhima River Valley. So in Western Deccan. So the horses that used to be imported by sea from the Middle East, so Iran, Iraq, the Arabian Peninsula, they consisted of Arab horses and Persian and Iraqi horses. So, not just horses that came from Arabia, but a certain breed of horses known as Arab horses, which were also bred in Iran and Iraq, besides other breeds. And I should mention that horses were also imported from Central Asia into South India, but the vast majority of horses that were imported were obviously the horses from the Middle East. And I want to talk a little bit about their journey, because you can just imagine what a long, arduous journey these horses had to make. And to that end, I'd like to read a short extract from my book. Arab horses were the thoroughbreds of their day, the prized steeds mounted by kings and generals, and reserved for elite sports like hunting, racing, and polo. However, the sea horses had anything but a sublime start to their life in India. Packed into ships along with huge reserves of feed and drinking water, the voyage would have been a hideous ordeal for delicate, sensitive horses prone to nerves and colic under the best of circumstances. They were bled before the journey to render them extremely tame and without any vice, and forced to stand throughout, secured with straps. One can imagine the horses neighing and stamping, scraping their hooves, as the ship tossed and turned on the high sea. The deck would have been drenched with their urine, seamen shoveling their dung overboard. The grass and straw that was spread for them to stand on and suppress the smell of urine and manure had to be constantly replaced. Yet neither that nor the frankincense that was part of the cargo, as another popular item of import from Arabia, would have been able to quash the intermingled smells of the sea and the horses. So, that is intended to give a sense of how difficult that journey would have been for horses. And there is a wonderful painting. There's a wonderful mural painting from the 17th, 18th century that captures this. You see how the horses are sort of packed into this one ship. And consequently, the mortality rates for these horses were quite high. They would very often get injured. Quite a few of them were to die. That's one side of it. On the other hand, there was a growing demand for horses in South India. From about the 12th century, cavalry warfare had caught on in South India, and the rulers of the South were largely cut off from the supply of horses from Central Asia or from Western India. So their sort of life depended on, the sea trade in horses. But because it was such a dangerous business, and because the mortality rates for these horses were so high, they had to incentivize this trade. So they would go to great lengths to sort of attract horse traders to do business with them. For example, just to give you some examples from the 13th to 15th century, there was a Yadava ruler who patronized pirates on the condition that they deliver the horses from their booty, their loot, to the ruler. Then the Pandyan king Sundara, he would sort of make advance payments for horses, and for a fixed number of horses, and it didn't matter if some of them died during the journey. The Emperor Salluv Narsimha of the Vijayanagar Empire was a little bit cannier. He needed proof. He asked for proof. So he would also pay, he would also make advance payments, but he would insist that the traders show him proof of the horses actually having died at sea in the form of their tails. And I should mention that by this time, so we're talking from about the turn of the 14th century, the predominant power of North India was the Delhi Sultanate. And the Delhi Sultanate followed a policy of monopolizing the supply of horses into India. And that is one of the reasons that gave them such an edge. They started to also sort of extract the best of horses from South India. So, for example, the Kakatiya ruler, Pratap Rudra, had to pay an annual tribute, which included 12,000 horses. There are also instances of generals of the Sultan of Delhi raiding horses from South Indian rulers. By the 12th century, Brahman horse traders, the Kutirai Chettis from the Malabar coast, were the dominant players. And there's one wonderful inscription which talks about one such horse trader. His name was Chatti Setti, and the inscription says that he delivered in ships multitudes of horses which were ornaments to the horse of Hari. And such was his clout as a horse trader, because he delivered this highly valuable commodity to his patron, the Hoysal ruler, that he ended up becoming a courtier. So horse traders obviously had a lot of clout. And from the 13th century onwards, foreign merchants, so some Central Asian Turks, but mainly Arabs and Iranians, began to dominate this trade. From the 10th century itself, they were these Arab and many of these Arab and Iranian traders different South Indian rulers would appoint them the administrators and governors of coastal areas. Now, it's worth asking why horses weren't being bred in South India, at least not to the extent to meet the entire demand, and why such vast numbers of horses had to be imported, so much so that the South Indian rulers were prepared to go to such great lengths to acquire them. Well, some foreign commentators, Marco Polo, then the Ilkhanate Iranian historian Abdullah Wasaf, have left very disparaging accounts of the horse scene of South India. I mean, they were all of the opinion, and they were speaking actually about a very specific region. They were speaking about the Coromandel. And they were saying there's something wrong with this place. Horses can't be bred here. They don't know how to look after horses. They don't know how to care for horses. They don't give horses a proper feed. This reputation, which actually pertained to a specific region and a specific time, sort of spread, and all of India was tarnished with the same brush. So the general impression, so even to date, people have wondered why so many horses had to be imported in India. What was it about India that horses couldn't be bred in India? That is not the entire picture. Because like I said, first of all, the commentary of Marco Polo and Wasaf is sort of dubious, because it was not based on first-hand information. It was biased. Yeah, it reflected a lot of the biases of the horse traders. And the horse traders themselves went to great lengths to ensure that horses weren't bred in the South, so that their business would not be affected. Obviously, there was a dearth of resources and technical know-how, but even the horse traders made sure that that there were few enterprises to breed horses in this in South India. Like, for example, they would ensure that farriers weren't farriers who sort of shoed horses, shod horses, and who also sort of were veterinarians who were very knowledgeable about horse care, weren't allowed to travel to South India. Then brood mares, so mares from which breeding stock was hardly ever imported to India. So there were all these reasons, and like I said, there was an entire nexus of breeders, traders, even rulers of the Middle East that were complicit in this trade and made a lot of profit from this trade. So, for example, the Prince of Eden became apparently one of the richest princes just from levying taxes on all the ships that would sail across the Arabian Sea to South India. Then there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of talk about how poor the diet used to be, the diet that was given to the horses. Again, it wasn't the best diet by modern standards. But it wasn't the sort of the South Indians were feeding their horses their own staples, and it wasn't all bad. It would probably made for an adequate diet. And we have to bear in mind considering how high the turnover rate was, considering how high the mortality rate was, we have to bear in mind that a lot of the horses that arrived after these difficult journeys were probably worse for the wear, injured and worse for the wear. And there was a good chance of them sort of, dying, breaking down and dying. So since at least the 13th century, these Arab Iranian horse traders were dominant. There was a Portuguese interlude between the 16th and the 17th century for 1 century. But otherwise, it was the Arabs and the Iranians who had control over this trade. Abdullah actually said something very nice. And that's another reason why the South Indians were quite happy importing horses, and they were not so fussed about breeding their own horses. And that is because it's now that we think in terms of distinct geographical territories, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East. And someone pointed this out actually to me when I was giving one of my talks, that these were all imagined as interconnected spaces. So there was an established pattern by which horses were imported, and that sufficed for the longest time. Then we come to the early 14th century, by which time South India, and I'm using the term extremely broadly, by the way. So the top half, so I'm basically talking about the peninsula, and that too, sort of the lower half of the peninsula. The top half was taken over by the Bahamani Sultanate, and the lower half, the deep south, was under the Vijayanagar Empire got established. And the Bahamani Sultanate, in any case, was very open to Persianate culture and welcomed sort of Persianized men from Iran, from the Middle East, from Central Asia, to serve within the establishment, on the government, in their army. And there was also this great taste for horses from the Middle East, which were considered highly prestigious. This Nikitin, a Russian horse trader, also found his way into the south. And he mentioned that the nobles are extremely opulent and delight in luxury. But this also brought about a certain divide between sort of all these Westerners, as they were called, who traveled to serve the Bahamani Sultanate, who got absorbed within the Bahamani Sultanate, and sort of the Deccanies, and also the Ethiopian slaves So much so that a Sultan Ahmad Bahamani II, ordered that in court and in cavalry formation, there would be two parts. The Westerners would be on the right side, would be on the right side, and the Deccanies and the Ethiopians would be on the left side. And one of the Iranians who actually rose to great heights was again a horse trader. This was Mahmud Gawan, who became famous as Malik ul Tujjar, so the king of merchants. He ended up becoming the prime minister of the Bahamani Sultanate. He became very powerful. But his original claim to fame was as a horse trader. And what his example proves is that the trade in horses didn't just provide a lot of opportunities for social mobility, but it was so lucrative that the established elite from overseas and from India started to dabble in it. So here was an Iranian who found this trade to be so profitable that he he took it up, and he was able to use it as the means to enter the Bahamani Sultanate and make a mark for himself. Eventually, of course, the rivalry between the Westerners and the Deccanies put a lot of pressure on the Sultanate, and it broke up into the 5 successor states: Ahmednagar, Bijapur, Golconda, Bidar, and Berar. In the meanwhile, what happens with the Vijayanagar Empire? It becomes one of the great early modern empires, because it spreads to encompass the Karnataka, Tamil regions. But even before it expanded into the fertile Tamil regions, it conquered the Canara coast. Again, because the original motivation was to take control of the ports through which these horses were imported, because they obviously realized that horsepower would really help them expand. This is a view of the outer wall surrounding the Ramachandra temple at Hampi, and it was built by the Vijayanagar Emperor Devraya I. What it depicts is the processions during Dashera, when horses would sort of have center stage. So the parade of horses would be one of the highlights of the 9-day festival, celebrating the the emperor's karmic duty as a warrior. And he would himself appear. So there are these, so basically these friezes depict, can be related to textual descriptions from a century later by the Portuguese horse trader Domingo Pérez and Fernão Nunes. And they talk about these processions of horses. And they talk about how the emperor would lead the procession on the state horse, the horse that apparently he would be sworn in on. So the symbolic importance of the horse is also constantly increasing. Then Pérez also mentions that outside the Ramachandra temple, a fair used to be held where local horses used to be sold, right? So again, it was the elite classes that demanded and that bought and rode these horses that were imported. All along, local horses were also being produced for the lower rungs. And it's worth mentioning that horses so it was Devraya II, the Vijayanagar Emperor Devraya II, who transformed the empire from a medieval South Indian state into a very powerful empire. And one of the steps that he took was to make cavalry quite centric to his military campaigns and to his army. Before that, the Vijayanagar Empire used to keep losing to the Bahamani Sultanate. And Devraya II realized that it's because the Bahamani Sultanate's cavalry was much stronger and they had mounted archers. So he made great effort to ensure that he hired a lot of sort of Muslim, cavalrymen and mounted archers, and he ensured that the empire was conducive, that his subjects were welcoming of these outsiders, and the empire was conducive to them coming and establishing themselves there, and they in turn would train his army to have larger and larger contingents of cavalry. And that obviously paid off because they increasingly became quite dominant. They could really hold their own against the Bahamani Sultanate. And he also made an effort to take control of the horse trade that passed through the southwestern coast. In fact, such was the rivalry between the Bahamani Sultanate and the Vijayanagar Empire to obtain horses, that at one point, a Vijayanagar emperor had thousands of Arab traders at the port of Honavar killed. He had them. He had this massacre conducted because they had been selling their horses to the Bahamani Sultan. So there was a great rivalry, and there was an attempt between these two great kingdoms of the south to gain a monopoly over the supply of horses from the Middle East. And of course, the Portuguese made the most of it. During that 1 century of the Portuguese cartel, they did their best. First of all, once after they established themselves in Goa and they took over Hormuz, they did what they had to do. They made a very conscious effort to ensure that all this horse trade was directed through Goa. And a lot of ports, consequently, that had flourished and that had seen a lot of horse trade, like Dhabol, Bhaktal, Honavar, Chol, they all sort of crashed because all the horse trade started being directed through Goa. And in fact, the Portuguese tried to make the most of the rivalry between first the Bahamani Sultanate and the Vijayanagar Empire, thereafter the main successor state, Bijapur. And so Afonso de Albuquerque writes to the Portuguese king about the horse trade. It yields incredible profits because bringing these horses from Hormuz, from the coast of Arabia to Goa, it is possible to gain 300, 400, or 500% of the profits. So, and there was at one point a great hue and cry that how can the Portuguese as Christians be selling horses to non-Christians? And the Portuguese defended themselves by saying, oh, but since these horses are used in the rivalry between these Indian states, it benefits us. Meanwhile, the Vijayanagar emperors were so terribly keen on horses, they were so mad about these horses, that Krishnadeva Raya's, the great Vijayanagar emperor, the royal advice that he gives in this Telugu work that he wrote called the Amukta Malyada, he writes, manage your ports well. It sort of really sums up the importance of the horse trade to the rulers of the south and of horses. He says, manage your ports well and let commerce increase in horses, elephants, and gems, pearls and sandal paste, merchants who bring elephants and good horses all the way from distant lands should be given villages and good houses and a favorable price and honored with audiences, so that they come to you in the normal course and the war animals don't go to the enemy. And, so horse trade, it wasn't just the trade in horses. It sort of paved the way for a lot of migrations, for a lot of different communities to come and settle in South India. And the rulers, like the Vijayanagar emperors, went out of their way to welcome and accommodate these people. And by the end of it, the establishment, the Vijayanagar emperor's stables was, comprised such a vast establishment that they were hiring 1,600 grooms, 300 trainers, and several farriers. By then, clearly, farriers were available in South India. And the association between manliness and horsemanship is very much there. There are descriptions by Pays and Nunes about Krishna Dev Raya, how he would get up in the morning, apply a lot of oil, spend hours wrestling and doing exercises. And then finally he would gallop his horse up and down the plains, right? And over time, obviously, the horses even began to be bred. So a Vijayanagar emperor, Achyut Dev Raya, what he would do is he would sell local horses, the horses that he bred, to his captains and soldiers. So clearly local horses were ridden by the rank and file, whereas sort of the emperor and the generals and the the topmost echelon had this preference for imported horses. So he would sell off his local horses and he would use the profits from those sales to acquire horses from the Middle East for himself. And it obviously benefited the Vijayanagar Empire quite a bit, because they were able to expand all the way up to even conduct campaigns right up to East India. And they won the Battle of Raichur, which was highly cavalry driven, but that can also be partly blamed on Bijapur's faulty use of guns and artillery. But that dependence on horses, that sort of cavalry-centric outlook, also became the Achilles heel of the Vijayanagar emperors, because at Talikota, at the Battle of Talikota, when 4 of the Deccan Sultanate sort of teamed up and took on the Vijayanagar Empire, they lost in spite of their awesome cavalry, because they had failed to incorporate gunpowder technology, which the sultanates of the south had done much more effectively. In any case, and obviously after the Battle of Talikota, the empire sort of began to decline and ultimately ended up becoming a small provincial kingdom. But the main Deccan sultanates by this time, Ahmednagar and Bijapur flourished, and also Golconda flourished. And they became more and more passionate, and a wonderful painting tradition, a wonderful courtly painting tradition developed, which sort of depicts horses as status symbols. So from this period, you get a lot of equestrian portraits of different emperors and princes and noblemen mounted on their favorite horses. You also get, in this case, Ibrahim Adil Shah II is hawking, so hunting with a hawk on horseback. Then you also get rather wonderful paintings like this, which shows the concern with the daily life of the horse. So the horse is not just depicted as an elite animal, but is also depicted in terms of its association with farriers. So here the horse is being shod, and it's surrounded by its grooms or caretakers. So you get lots of paintings like this. This painting is, to me, particularly telling, this Deccan painting, because it just goes to show how horses were not just valued as war animals, as fighting machines, but were also coveted as status symbols, almost as luxury items, horses from the Middle East. So you see how this horse occupies center stage, and from its physiognomy, you can tell that this is an Arab horse, right? And you can see how the horse is clearly the horse is clearly the hero in this painting. Yeah. Okay, and to mention one of the most well-known horsewomen, or at least a woman who became immortalized on horseback, that's Chand Bibi. So Chand Bibi was a princess of Ahmednagar who married Ali Adil Shah of Bijapur in 1564 in the build-up to Talikota. Her husband died and she returned to Ahmednagar and sort of took charge of matters, became the de facto ruler. She, meanwhile, the Mughal Emperor Akbar mounted a siege on Ahmednagar. And the siege was going really badly for the subjects of Ahmednagar. And at one point, there was a blast and, there was a hole in the wall of the citadel. at which point Chand Bibi, that is the incident for which she's most famous, she sort of appeared at that spot, and she rallied the troops, and then they were able to mount a resistance, and Akbar had to withdraw the siege. In any case, she ultimately was killed, but much long after. So about more than a century after she died, these paintings of her began to be produced. Perhaps they were produced earlier, but the earliest known painting is this one from the turn of the 18th century. And through the 18th century, from very many different contexts, paintings of her hawking on horseback began to be produced. And these are very beautiful paintings because, she's always portrayed as a very elegant woman, in complete control of her horse. And you wonder why she was depicted in this way. Now we know that the women of the Deccan, of the sultanates of the Deccan, used to go hunting on horseback. They used to ride, they used to go hunting. We also know, there are also examples from Vijayanagar we also get textual references from the Vijayanagar Empire of women riding. But the reason why Chand Bibi became sort of iconized like this is because it is the perfect iconography for a woman like her, a woman who was known for her beauty and grace, but who also became known as a warrior woman because she had, at a very crucial juncture, taken charge of Ahmednagar's, she had rallied the troops and got them to hold their own against the Mughal army. So it's the association of power and refinement in this iconography of Chand Bibi. How are we doing for time? Okay, we have time.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I also want to say, okay, I'll come to this later. So the Mughals also were the Mughals got their main supply of horses from Central Asia, but the horses from the Middle East were considered the most prestigious. So much so that at one point Jahangir writes about his father Akbar. Despite his rulership and treasuries and treasures beyond remuneration, despite his war elephants and Arabian horses, never did he place his foot one iota above the level of humility before the divine court and considered himself the least of all creatures, right? So the point of the larger dedication is to emphasize Akbar's piety. But incidentally, Arab horses are mentioned as a marker of a great king. So that goes to show the regard in which Arab horses were held. And from the late 16th century to the early 18th century, Surat and Cambay were the main ports through which the Mughal supply of horses streamed in, right? And it was considered a great honor. So Jahangir received a lot of gifts of Arab Persian horses from the Sultan of Iran, with whom he used to have a friendly rivalry over Kandahar. And he in turn would re-gift these horses. So that used to be considered a matter of great prestige. I mean, it was a great honor if you received a horse that the Mughal emperor had received from the Shah of Iran, and that he in turn gifted to, say, a noble or a courtier. And you have some wonderful names. Like there was a horse that Jahangir writes about called Rum Ratan. So the name means the Jewel of Anatolia. And that horse was gifted to Jahangir by the Shah of Iran after it was captured from the Ottoman army. And that horse was then gifted by Jahangir to his son, the future Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan himself was a great connoisseur of horses and jewels, and he made sure that his best men were in charge of the ports of Surat and Cambay so that they could keep an eye out for the best of jewels and horses passing through these ports. He wanted to be able to grab them before anybody else did. And he would also acquire horses directly from the Middle East. So they continued to be quite important even to the Mughal Empire. And again, to go back to the importance of horse traders, one wonderful example is Mir Jumla, who started life as the assistant of a horse trader from Iran, from Isfahan. But then he was able to capitalize on all the connections that came with that. He became a diamond merchant. He became a shipping magnate. He he ingratiated himself with the Sultan of Golconda, who gave him the title of Mir Jumla. And finally, of course, he jumped ship and went over to Aurangzeb and became one of his leading generals and grandees. So there are lots of such examples. But I should mention that it was not just, horse traders who were, it was not just the traders who were sort of following the trail of the horse and migrating to India. But the demand for horses also created a lot of opportunity for other kinds of immigrants. There's not, like, for example, artisans and craftspeople. Obviously, there are not very many histories about them. There are not very many references about them. But a foreign traveler, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, a jewel merchant from France, he was at one point traveling from Iran to Golconda. And on the ship, he notes that there were 4 or 5 shoemakers or saddlers. So there were opportunities also for lower class migrants to come to India. After the Battle of Talikota, the trade in horse begins to decline because, the Vijayanagar Emperor is obviously much reduced in stature and not able to pay those kind of prices. And the cavalry warfare begins to decline in the south. But nonetheless, there was a great demand. And for example, sort of evoking the desperation of the South Indian rulers of yore, you have a reference to Hyder Ali, so Tipu Sultan's father, trying to again incentivize the trade and once again paying in advance. But he wanted to be able to see the ears and the tails of horses, right? And all these references to horses being imported and rulers wanting to see as proof of them actually having been, having died at sea, wanting to see tails and ears. It goes to show how many horses would have died at sea and how their bodies, their carcasses would have been thrown overboard. So, then, like I said, I want one of the most recent migrant horse trader to come to India to make his fortune and to be able to rise to great heights is Aga Ali Ashkar. So he ended up establishing himself in Bangalore, and he became very close to the British Commissioner Mark Gubbin and also Maharaja Krishnaraj Vadiyar III. And because of what connected them was their mutual passion for horses. By this time, the British were in charge, but Arab horses were still considered quite prestigious. And it's his connection with horses that allowed him to migrate to India and establish himself as an important citizen so quickly. And interestingly, his descendant is Fawad Mirza, who represented India in the Olympics recently, who was, I think, the first Indian finalist in the equestrian sport of eventing. So I think that's a wonderful connection that shows us how crucial the trade in horses was. It wasn't just a matter of commerce and business, but the extent to which it had an impact on, different South Indian societies. Anyway, just quickly to the breeding of horses, as the examples from the Vijayanagar Empire have shown us, horses were bred within the studs of Vijayanagar emperors, perhaps within the rural landscape. It's not like they weren't bred, but most of the breeding seems to have been concentrated in northern Deccan, or at least western Deccan. So much so that by the late 18th century, a commentator writes, "Were you to ask me where the best horses are found, I would say first of all the valley of the Bhima River in the Deccan. Its horses are hardy and capable of traveling long stages on meager food." So these were what became famous as the Deccani horses or the Bhima ponies that the Maratha light cavalry bred and used. And if by the late 18th century, these horses were well established, the Marathas would have started breeding them from at least a century before. So by the 18th century, a very very specialized horses were being bred. Horses that, so the Marathas, as the Marathas over time began to specialize, the Maratha light cavalry became famous for its mobility. And they began to specialize in guerrilla tactics that enabled them actually to get the upper hand on even the mighty Mughals. And what is it about them? What the horses? So to be able to practice these guerrilla tactics, they needed horses which were small and quick and hardy. And those are the sort of horses that they increasingly began to breed. So horses would have been important to the rural landscape of the Deccan all along. They would have been used in the fights for pasture land, in cattle raids. The pastoral nomadic communities would have used them as pack animals, which is why a number of pastoral deities, Khandoba, as in the image, and Biroba, are depicted as mounted on horses. And these horses increasingly were the ones that the Marathas came to use. Someone wrote about these horses, and from having, I don't have an image, sadly, of a Maratha horse, because I should mention that this is a breed that is now extinct. After having risen to such great heights, it became extinct because the British didn't tend to think very highly of Indian breeds. Anyways, but before that, these horses seem to have been bred from local mares and Arab stallions, as also the Kathiawadi and the Marwadi. So two other indigenous horse breeds. And until the 19th century, the horse fair of Malegaon used to be very popular. Used to be a popular place where Maratha horses used to be, the Deccani Bhima horses used to be sold. And it catered to, over time, it began to cater to the Maratha princely states in Hyderabad. And we also have wonderful references to Maratha women riding. There is one, Tarabai, then Lakshmibai, the Rani of Jhansi. They've all been immortalized on horseback. And there is a wonderful account by the British Memsahib Fan Parks, in which she goes riding with the Queen of Gwalior, the Dowager Queen of Gwalior, Bezabai, and her retinue of women. And she talks about what wonderful horsewomen they are, how knowledgeable Bezabai is as a horsewoman, and she's an excellent judge of horses. She can tell a good horse from a bad horse quite easily. And she was very struck that these women, Maratha women, ride horses sitting on the horse's astride like men, whereas British women have to ride side saddle. So yeah, I think that's it. I end on the note of women and what great horse women we used to have.
Thank you. That was really wonderful. And it also throws open a lot of questions. I don't know whether all the viewers have a thorough familiarity with some of these issues. But anyway, I will ask some questions that I have, and then I will also mix it along with the questions that some of the viewers have asked.
Yeah.
More fundamentally, the first time, I mean, from the historic accounts, we see that horse is somewhat introduced into India through Aryan migration process, right? Leaving out the questions on that is migration, invasion, all that. The first time, the earliest time in the Indian Indic region, if you could call it. What is the earliest evidence that we have, spread out from either all the way from Afghanistan to the modern Bangladesh? When do we see a horse, remnants of bones or whatever it is, the earliest that is available to us?
Okay, so the native population of horses disappeared in 8000 BCE. Then through the Bronze Age Harappan civilization, at least through the earlier periods, there's hardly any evidence of horses. There's just not enough evidence to suggest that horses were widely available or domesticated. It's only from the later Harappan period that you begin to find some fragmentary evidence of horses. And the evidence increases more and more from the 15th century. So, it's the obvious conclusion to draw, to correlate, the arrival of the horse on the Indian scene with the arrival of the Indo-Aryans.
Because in all the earliest epics, at least the Ramayana and Mahabharata, horses very much at the center of.
Very much.
Very important.
From the sort of, even in the Rig Veda, the horse is mentioned many more times than the cow, for example. And the horse is mentioned a number of times. I forget the exact number, maybe some, let me quickly check. But there are numerous references to the horse in the Rig Veda itself. And of course, the horse, the Ashwamedh Yag are very central events in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata.
Correct. No, horse as a, horse sacrifice is one thing, but horse as the core of your, your army, right, is an entirely different thing, right? You could still have.
I understand what you mean. It's the horse-drawn chariots of the Aryans that enabled the Indo-Aryans that enabled them to spread so quickly across North India and establish themselves. And horse-drawn chariots would have been a key component of ancient Indian armies till about, and they would have continued till about the 7th century CE. Ancient Indian armies used to be Chaturubhang. So they used to consist of 4 arms, one of which would be the horse-drawn chariots and also cavalry. So over time, horses began to be ridden into war.
Right. Now, that's where my question really comes. If horse was so central, what version of, what breed of it is one thing. It was so central right from north to south. We see that in the Tamil Sangam literature talking about horses as part of the army to a certain extent. Why then was this Central Asian, Arab horses even important? Because there should be a complete local breed. You talk about local breed. That local breed should be, should have permeated every corner of India by then, right? If it was as ancient as a few thousand years old.
Yeah, but we are thinking about local, like the idea of what is local has also changed. When you talk about local, you're basically talking about the Indian subcontinent. But historically, in the ancient period, for example, the distinction between the subcontinent and Central Asia and the Middle East would not have been so perhaps pronounced. And there was so obviously the culture of breeding horses in India became established over time. You have references from even ancient India. There's Panini talks about horses from what would correspond to Punjab and even Gujarat, right? So you do have references, horses. That's what horses were being bred from the ancient period itself. It's just that not enough horses were being bred to meet the growing demand for horses over centuries and millenniums. And they were constantly supplemented by, the supply of horses from Central Asia and Middle East. And over time, imported horses probably also became prestigious. So as the example of the Vijayanagar Emperor proves, that the emperor and his generals would have preferred to ride Arab Persian horses, whereas the rank and file, ordinary soldiers would have had to make do with local horses.
Okay. So the effort, all the effort of transporting them through the sea, where a lot of them were dying, still worth it.
Well, yeah, that's
From
what
from both monetary value,
yeah,
and that's a trader will come and sell it.
yeah,
But it was obviously making a big difference, not only in terms of the prestige aspect of it, but also they must have probably outperformed the Indian breeds on the battlefield. Because it's not,
I'm not so sure about it. By the way, can you come on screen? I'm just looking at myself, which is a bit strange.
No, I am on screen. If you just select gallery in the view, you will see.
Okay. Oh, okay. Because then I'll be talking to you rather than just.
No, I see. Yeah.
I'm not really prepared to make. I'm not prepared to make that distinction between superior and inferior horses. Right? Because it's very often a matter of mindset. If you associate prestige with a certain kind of horse, if you used to riding a certain kind of horse, you will find other kinds of horses rubbish. And I know this from my own riding experience. Right? So there's not enough information for us to say, the horses that were being bred in India were rubbish compared to the horses that were being imported. Like, for example, Central Asian horses, even Central, okay, fine. If we were to say that foreign horses were superior to Indian horses, there were two streams of foreign horses, three actually. There were Tibetan horses also. But the two main streams were the Central Asian horses and the horses from the Middle East, right? But even within those two horses, the horses from the Middle East were considered more prestigious, right? So, but like, for example, the Mughal army, the two main contingents of horses were the Central Asian horses and an Indian breed of horses. Do you see what I mean?
No, my whole question comes from your own, the presentation, where there were some quotes. You said they were withholding the mares, which would help breed them in Indian context. So they were obviously trying to, it is sort of like today's way of protecting your technology. So I will sell it to you, but I won't do technology transfer. I won't do technology transfer. Right? So that basically meant that there is something, the particular breed it's got to be, superior in a sense. Why else would you do that kind of protection, right?
Because there isn't a tradition of horse breeding in a particular region. So consequently, you have to buy horses, right? Then why would the seller of horses impart the technology, the information, the knowledge that would enable you to breed your own horses, right? And I have given some reasons for why not enough horses were being bred in India. Possibly, because again, India is so vast and so many different regions and so many different environmental, climatic conditions. It's very difficult to generalize, but it seems that there were not enough areas where horses could be bred in herds. Like for example, the kind of pastures that you have in Central Asia, we didn't have them in India. And
anywhere in India for that matter.
Like, for example, there would have been very few castes which were dedicated exclusively to breeding horses. Most pastoral classes bred horses, the pastoral classes that bred horses did so alongside breeding other kinds of horses. The only community that comes to mind were the Kathis of Gujarat that actually specialized in breeding horses, that almost exclusively bred horses.
Okay. Now, just to add one more question here.
But I just want to say, this is more a reflection. We are projecting our concern, with our like what is that? Atmanirbhar Bharat. Our notion
No.
of Atmanirbhar Bharat on the past. Like I said, maybe they were quite, they thought of Asia as an interconnected space. And when there was a well-established pattern by which horses were being imported, maybe they just didn't feel the need to start breeding their own horses.
Well, my point did not come from that. It was more about the kind of, the edge that it was giving you in the battlefield, right? So, I mean, from your presentation, I could draw two things, right? One is that the horses were providing an edge, and therefore they were coveted, and therefore you must, if I were a king, I don't want to lose out, right? So I must have like today's equivalent of a nuclear weapon. And how it shifts, for example, the moment gunpowder comes, the horse doesn't matter anymore. I mean, in the sense that even with horses, Vijayanagar Empire loses out in Talikota. Right?
Exactly.
Yes, if even more superior technology comes, which is quite natural, right? And the one who adapts to that, to the best technology, will keep winning. So it's only from that angle that the importance of a horse, its fleet-footedness, its speed that you can provide, and so on. That's a key. It's exactly the kind of question that Ramki has asked in the YouTube channel, where he's quoting that Marco Polo quote that you said. That Marco Polo said there was no possibility of breeding horses in South India.
That's a bit extreme.
And even if it were, it will not be fit to ride. Obviously, he was making a wild claim, right? But he was a traveler for a short term. What made him even think like that? He was probably seeing horses in the regions that he was visiting, but not of the same quality here, and so he
maybe the Italians were just snobbish, because I know of one instance when a Venetian ambassador from around the same time was slagging off the English horses, and he was saying much the same thing. Oh, these English, they don't know how to feed, they don't know how to look after their horses, they don't know how to feed their horses. So like I said, there's not enough information for us to make this distinction between superior and inferior horses. Because, the rank and file of even the Vijayanagar Empire was increasingly riding local horses. The Rajputs had a definite preference for local horses. Then the Marathas bred horses that served their purpose best. And they made use of those horses.
There is a question from someone who calls himself Learn and Grow. He wants to know.
We're all trying to learn and grow.
How the extensive horse trade after the 12th century facilitated the caravan traders and merchants in land trade and commerce.
Oh, that's really interesting. So alongside the sea trade and horses, the overland trade, the caravan trade from both Central Asia and Tibet flowed. And it was even more voluminous, actually. So through the medieval and the early modern period, still about the 18th, 17th century, horses were one of the two main items of import. And from the 18th century, it appears, before the British entered the picture and just basically slagged off not just Indian but Asian horses, and tried to import horses from Europe and Australia to sort of improve the horse flesh of India. I mean, before the British came along, and after these foreign supplies of horses began to dry up over the course of the 17th century, increasingly local horses filled that breach, stepped into that breach. And I think I've argued that through at least the early 18th century, most of, it was the different Indian armies were mainly making use of local horses, Indian horses.
So there's this comment from Gopu. Says in the 1920s, the British Raj imported Australian horses called whalers
Whalers,
in
yeah.
vast numbers.
Yeah.
Even in the World War II, horses outnumbered tanks. Why didn't mechanization eliminate horses until the 1950s?
Oh, that's a good question. Actually, through World War I and II, all-time high numbers of horses were used. So horses weren't done away with instantly with mechanization. It happened over time, but that was sort of the last hurrah of horses, the two world wars. I mean, after that, it gradually declined the use of horses.
Right.
I mean, I think maybe we were still in the period of hybrid models.
Right. Right. Obviously, I mean, because you do.
It was a period of transition.
Right. You do have the mechanized vehicle, tanks or whatever, or even just the jeeps, but it required the large volume of production to hit that tipping point, and you needed the supply lines, the petrol for that, the spares and mechanics to fix it. I think it was a question of developing that network, and then the switchover happened. Now today it is.
Even now, in some matters, horses are still considered more effective, like in controlling mobs.
Right.
And certain terrains, I think, were also, horses were more effective in certain terrain vis-a-vis the tanks of that time.
Correct. I mean, I guess, even now, if it's a kind of, a hilly terrain, where roads have not been paved, there's no way a mechanized vehicle is going to go there, right? A horse, on the other hand, either you walk or a well-trained horse for that particular terrain. And crowd control, you are right. Absolutely.
Which is why you still have a mounted police.
Right, absolutely.
But I was talking to somebody from the army, and he was talking about how until quite recently, they used to breed horses and especially mules because certain parts of the border up in the Himalayas could only be traversed by these creatures. It was not very easy for vehicles to go up to those points or travel through those terrains. But now the technology has become so sophisticated that you do in fact have those vehicles, and roads are being built. More importantly, roads are being built.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now you don't need those mules and pack animals and horses in the same way.
Correct. So there's an interesting question from Arjun Valsaraj. Is where indigenous Indian horses exported?
Oh, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking that question. Actually, funnily enough, Akbar at one point, I read this, he banned the export of Indian horses. So it proves two things. First of all, not enough horses were being bred in India to be able to export them. And second, they weren't considered so bad that they couldn't be exported. No, I don't think Indian horses were being exported because there were just not enough of them being bred in India. Whatever was being bred in India was being used up in India. There was no surplus. Like Central Asia and the Middle East produced a surplus of horses.
Anyway, so possibly Southeast Asia could have been a market, possibly if there were no bans, right, to the Thailand and Malaysia.
Oh, they had their own horses.
Okay. Okay. So I guess the market here itself was so large. Like you banning wheat import right now because your demand is larger at any given point.
But thank God, because it did bring about a certain globalization, this horse trade. It did make India more global. It enabled a lot of migrations, a lot of interactions with different parts of Asia. And, so that is not to be, that is something, I think.
One of the, you mentioned about some of the horse-mounted deities. We have a history right from the Surya sun god mounted on horses.
It's not mounted on a horse. Actually, if you think about it, very few deities are mounted on horses. the Surya rides a 7-horse-drawn chariot.
No, that's one thing. That's correct. But
Hmm.
you also have the horse-mounted, particularly, if you go to the Surya temples, the Sun Temple of Konark, for example, all the three sides, those are directly horse-mounted, if I'm not mistaken. The chariot with 7 horses driven by Aruna is one thing. Okay? But there is also the direct, horse-mounted, Surya of, different named versions of them.
But apart from Surya,
there is nobody. There's nobody. That's the, that I couldn't recall. And that's where it was interesting, because I had not heard of the 2 deities you mentioned, Kantoba and another name you said, which I didn't catch.
Viroba. Yeah,
Viroba.
These are pastoral deities. Quite a few pastoral deities were mounted on horses. So from Rajasthan, Western India, you do have a number of folk deities who are mounted on horses.
Okay. In these, across Tamil Nadu, you would see large terracotta horses in the Ayanar temples. You will see them.
Yeah. So the other deity who one of whose vehicle is the horse, overshadowed by the peacock, is Kartik.
Okay. Is that so?
Yeah, I think that is one of his vahanas.
But I have not. I don't remember seeing Kartikeya mounted on a horse.
Yeah,
and, on elephant, yes. On peacock, yes. With the cock, which is generally around on his flag. So that's a symbol. But on a horse, again, it has to be checked.
I can't remember any depictions, but I think I have read that is one of the vahanas of Kartik. And considering that he is the god of war, I can believe it. But I might be talking through my hat. I will have to check.
No, I know as a warrior, as the head of the Devas, he was
Indra.
Probably more on an elephant. Is my guess.
They had an elephant and a horse. They were both kingly symbols. So there are lots of examples, like what are they called? The 10 Ratnas, or in Buddhist art, 2 of them are the horse and the elephant, right? Then Indra had a horse and an elephant. Then, so the horse and the elephant sort of go hand in hand, because
absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned, Uchai Shravas, with a great story. We have, of course, before I ask a couple of other questions, there is a very popular story as part of one of the Saivite signs, Manikavachakar, where he is a minister for the Pandya king, and he's, he takes money from the king to go and get horses. And he ends up spending all the money on Shaiva devotees, feeding them, and there's no money left. So Shiva then converts the foxes in the nearby forest to horses, and then sends them to the king. And then the story goes from
that's
there.
A fascinating story. Yeah. That's a fascinating story. I've read that story. It's lovely. No, and you were saying something about some temples, the terracotta.
So, these are all across Tamil Nadu. You go around. There are these village, deities who are the protective deities of the village. You have Madurai Veeran, Ayyanar. So there will be a bunch of them. They're all made of terracotta.
Right.
Large horses.
Yeah.
The horses are sort of standalone horses. Sometimes the horses also will have the deities. And there's fantastic, very large horses. Almost every village in Tamil Nadu will have them. They are very, very recent origin. I don't know if they were there 300 years, 500 years, 700 years. We don't know that. But certainly in the last 200 years, many of them.
It is the valorization of the horse warrior. The horse warrior became a became a prestigious creature.
Right.
So a certain prestige was attached to horses.
Yeah. Ravi Thallapragada is a little angry that I said Manika Vasagar's stories, and he says they are life or not, they are history recorded by locals. So I will leave it at that. But he wants to know certain things from you.
Okay.
Can the text and books used by the presenter be made available to us? I would like to have them for my personal research purposes. So maybe they are all there in your book. That
the bibliography lists all my I have a very comprehensive bibliography.
Ravi, you can purchase the book, and that will have a lot of information. So that's that. And there is a question from there it is. There's a question from Abhimanyu Chandra.
Oh, that's not. I think I know him. Anyway.
Okay. Is there an American connection as far as the import or export of horses is concerned? For example, were American breeds ever brought or priced in India?
No. And because of our colonial history, even the horses that are ridden within urban elite horse sporting cultures tend to be of Europeans. Like, for example, thoroughbreds are very popular. They're, of course, now available in America as well. But our link with them has to do through Britain.
Okay.
So, not.
Okay. Yeah. So Ravi wants to know, can you at least mention some of them, one or two of them, three of them, maybe? Though he said he will look at the book, but references. So some.
Okay, so actually, I must tell you that there are very few dedicated sources, right? There is the Faras genre of Perso-Islamic texts. Then there's the Shalihotra genre. But these are more in the nature of bestiaries rather than being historical sources. There are very few dedicated historical sources. So almost all the books, the horse was such a central player. The horse was so ubiquitous that most books on Indian history will have references. Most historical chronicles, most books on Indian history will contain references to horses, but there aren't any such go-to books. I would suggest you read my book, have a look at my bibliography, and also Wendy Doniger's wonderful book, which is called Winged Stallions and Wicked Mares. So that's another book. I think between the two of them, between our two bibliographies, you'll get a good idea of all the different reference sources.
And
also there are different sources for different regions and different periods.
Okay, there's a question that I missed out. Jensen Fernando says there is a belief that the horse traders didn't teach the Indians the technique of fixing shoes on them.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, that's what I said. The farriers, they would prevent farriers from coming to India.
Okay, but this is also a little surprising to me.
Which would have lent them more fragile. So if they weren't wearing horseshoes, they would have been more prone to being lame. And there are references to horses going lame in India. Obviously, if they're being used as war animals and they don't have horseshoes on, then their legs are vulnerable, and it's only a matter of time before they go lame.
Okay. But again, even that is really surprising to me, because this is not a very complex technology, and any visitor who goes abroad to these places would have simply seen them and just come back.
Which is why, that's what I mean. Like Marco Polo, Vasaf, they were talking about a particular time, because farriery became well established in India. There were different communities of blacksmiths who began to specialize in making horseshoes and, shoeing horses. So it is a technology that developed, that was well established, I think, by the Vijayanagar Empire.
Okay. So there's a question from Ashutosh Patak, rather a comment. Can we say that the kingdoms in India were awed both by horses' swiftness and elephants' majesty? Or maybe horses had ritual significance as well instead of mere instrumental usage? I guess the ritual significance started fading out post-Vedic period.
It was a combination of both. They were important as war animals. There was a symbolic and ritualistic, associations. But also, please bear in mind that these are extremely these are highly intelligent, charismatic beings. Bonds were also formed between riders and their horses, humans and horses. It was a partnership, so there were also emotions involved. It was not a cold, prosaic, transactional relationship.
That's true. But what is a typical life expectancy of, any of these breeds, be it an Indian breed or an Arab breed?
25 to 30 years.
Of which, say, about 10 to 15 years will be their core battle readiness, assuming that they survive battles?
Yeah, up to 20, I would say. And in fact, there is Abul Fazl, the Mughal chronicler, talks about it. He gives the average lifespan of horses in the Mughal stables, and it is quite long, something like 22 years. So obviously the horses were being quite well looked after.
Okay, great. Wonderful. I think we have covered many of these
thank you so much.
Issues.
Pleasure.
I think Ravi is a little, Ravi Thallapragada is talking a lot about, history of Indians being written by others. And you mentioned Wendy Doniger, but no, the fact that...
But I've also written it.
Yes. So
I can show you my passport.
I guess more of our...
what matters, what matters is that you've dedicated your life to working on India,
right,
and that you are trained as a South Asianist.
No, I'm just, I just merely mentioned that. So thank you for a very entertaining talk. It's not a topic that we hear often. For us, horses, just another an animal, though it might have played a major role. And today, in a sense, right, we even see an odd elephant in a temple. But the horses, it's almost gone, except when we go to a beach and they have a pony ride here in the regions here. Most little towns don't have horses anymore.
There is a fantastic race course in Chennai.
Oh, Chennai alone, because of its connection to race, has it. You step out, you may go to Tanjavur or Trichy or rest of any of the other places. The horse is not there in our midst.
But that is the great irony of the history of the history of the horse. That from being so central and so ubiquitous, many millenniums were described by historians. Certain historians have described many millenniums as the age of the horse. So the history of humans is divided into the pre-horse age, the age of the horse, and the post-horse age. So the great ironies about the horse is from being so central, it has become so marginal.
Correct. And I know going forward, it will be an Olympic sport. Maybe we will see the ponies in some of the, if you want to go to Vaishno Devi temple or something like that. Or else it is probably only there as sculptures in some temples, not even all the temples. You talked about the Zararama temple in Hampi. But in most of the or the Tirupadai Marudur painting that you showed at the beginning, but most of our temples don't have horses depicted. Also, the bulk of the temples, because it's not. You may see an elephant, you may see a cow, but not a horse.
You just haven't looked for the horse.
It's actually.
I promise you, if you decide today that now you will keep an eye out for horses, you'll be amazed at how you see horses everywhere.
Let me take this up as a challenge and just go and look around. I mean, it's fascinating, and thank you for an excellent insight into this whole area, and it was really educational.
Yeah, it was a great pleasure for me to be able to talk on a specific aspect of my book.
Thank you, and thank you once again from Tamil Heritage Trust, and for all the viewers, we will be back again, and we will have another lecture first Saturday of next month. That's through this online, but we also have a third week, in-person interaction lecture, which will be in Tamil in Chennai, in RK Convention Center in Mylapore. Thank you all.